Hi, everybody. I'm Frank Bruni. This is Gail Mellow and Freeman Hrabowski. We are going to, in the interest of time and to speed things along, they've asked that they introduce themselves. They're just going to say a few remarks from the armchairs about who they are, where they're coming from, and then we're going to dive right into questions that I'll ask them, and then that'll leave us time to let all of you ask questions as well. So Gail, would you say hello to everyone?
I'd be happy to. It's great to be on this panel. It's great to see a lot of friendly faces in this room. I want to say a slightly heretical thing because, as you all know, I'm not just a former community college president, but I'm a crazy advocate, hair on fire kind of person. I would say that when we bemoan the loss of the humanities in higher ed, you're looking at the wrong half of higher ed. So half of all undergraduate students in the United States go to community colleges, just as a sort of snarky thing to do, not including any LaGuardia person. Because I know I have a bunch of them, like you just heard me. Can you raise your hand if you work at a community college? Okay. Can you raise your hand if you work at a four-year institution? Okay, so that's you're part of the problem, okay? So, sorry, you are. So we have to really understand where the humanities are alive and thriving, and if you all are not connecting to them, you are not creating the system that you need for humanities to thrive. One of the things I will thank Teagle for is a wonderful program that we're using at the City University of New York to train graduate students to really teach at the community colleges in humanities. But I'll tell you a sort of scary story, which was one of our students. He graduated from LaGuardia, a hard Scrabble kid, pulled himself up, wasn't brilliant as usual, went to, I'm going to say Hunter, I don't know if that was the right four-year college, went on to the City University of New York's graduate program, and then got in this fabulous Teagle program. He came to LaGuardia, where he refused to teach introduction to philosophy because it was beneath him. He was a graduate student, and there were much more narrow courses of action that he wanted to teach. So I think one of the things we have to do is to understand all of the ways in which we have a system that is broken and a way in which the humanities are essential to low-income students, but low-income students live in this country in community colleges. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Freeman Hrabowski, and I am from and of the South. And I say that because I'm looking at a bunch of Yankees out there. Being serious, I am from Birmingham. I am at UMBC in Baltimore. Baltimore is the Upper South. One day we think like Philadelphia, the next day like Richmond. It's been that way since the Civil War. But I grew up in Birmingham, and we Southerners love stories. And so I am the child of an English teacher. And so all of my life, I was immersed in literature. As a kid, my mother had me struggling with Dostoevsky. She would call me Raskolnikov when I was being arrogant. And my friends would say, what in the hell is she talking about, right? But she would also connect Dostoevsky to Ralph Ellison and Richard Wright. She would look at the connections between Notes from Underground and The Invisible Man. And so I had that sense of culture that would go beyond any particular race. I tell you that because I'm on a campus that has students like New York from over 100 countries. People don't think of Baltimore that way, but it is. And it is a campus that has students who are heavily science. It's 50 to 55% science, and this is all races. And it's a campus, it's the only one in the state of Maryland, founded at such a time that people of all races could go there. Every other campus in our state and every other state in the South, you either went to a black college or a white college. And that was true typically until the 60s. And I tell you that because today we are maybe half white. If you put whites and Asians together, you're talking about 60% of our students. And then the other 40% would be from minority groups, heavily underrepresented minorities. Everybody knows that we've now produced more blacks who've gone on to get MD PhDs in any university in the history of America. Give my colleagues a round of applause for that. It's a big deal. But this is the point I want to make to you. Number one, as a mathematician, and Gail says, are you ever not a mathematician since you've been president so many years? Once a mathematician, always a mathematician. Once a person of the humanities. Well, I keep telling people I'm a child of an English teacher because I've been rooted in the humanities all my life. And this is what I know, that we in this country tend to separate arts, humanities, and social sciences from math and science and stuff. First of all, we forget this idea of the quadrivium and the trivium, the idea that math and science are part of the liberal arts. Most people keep thinking it's only arts and humanities, number one. Number two, if I asked you the question, how many of you thought you were either a math science type or history English type when you were in the 11th or 12th grade? Raise your hands. If you already knew when you were in the 11th or 12th grade, you were either math, science, or history English, and there's a part of our challenge. And so I'm going to stop there because I'd like us to think about how we connect disciplines more. The favorite course on my campus is called The Mathematics of Being Human, taught by a Shakespeare scholar and a mathematician. Think about that. And finally, when we talk about least resource students, I saw that term. I want us to get beyond thinking only about the poorest of kids. We want to help low-income people, but working class people in this country, middle class and working class people can't get the financial aid. They don't know how to do it. And as a result, they're not becoming educated. And so how could they think critically about how you vote for someone or how you separate that which is truth from evidence? So we need to broaden our definition of people we need to bring into this work.
Okay. Gee, Freeman, are people not thinking critically about whom to vote for? Or?
I will be provocative.
My bad.
I will be provocative, and this is from our own campus where we take great pride in bringing together people from different political parties on our campus and talking about the need to learn how to agree to disagree agreeably, to be able to listen to other perspectives. Fred Lawrence says as well, you want to be able to present your own ideas, listen to others, and understand where the evidence is and find the common ground. The fact is we don't do that well now, and I would argue that many of us who have the same values have a kind of condescension towards people who don't think as critically, and they feel it. And this is this gap between those of us who have and who don't. And I think if we are truly broadly educated, we should be able to look in the mirror itself and say, let's think about how better to do this to pull people into this work.
Gail, you asked for a raise of hands about 4 years versus whatever, and you said that's part of the problem. Another part of the problem, I think, and I want to get your reaction to this, is us in the media. By that, I mean, there was one year, I think it was 2014, someone did a study, and in the New York Times, which is fairly representative of the, elite mainstream media, the proper noun Harvard appeared multiple times more over the course of that year than the noun community college, than mentions of all community colleges put together. So much of the conversation in the media, whether it's Varsity Blues, whether it's the recent decision with the Harvard lawsuit, is about a very, very small cluster of schools. How much harder does that make the work that you two do? Why is that so? And it's more so today than it was a decade ago. And how do we change it?
Well, I do think that sort of name brand is ascendant everywhere. And if Harvard is the pinnacle, well, then God, LaGuardia Community College has to be at the bottom. And instead, what places like Freeman's UMBC and my LaGuardia are these incredible instances of the power of education to transform and the American belief that if you want to do it and we can give you an opportunity, you should go. And so when you look at who gets into Harvard these days, it is not America. It is distinctly not America. And yet we have the potential, I think, to really create this vibrant system if we linked these two. So I remember in 1985, I had to look it up when I was standing in the back. Robert Cole, a great Harvard. My mic fell. Oh no. I'll keep talking. Now you know what I'm saying. So Robert Cole, who is a great Harvard professor, humanitarian, wrote a book called The Call of Story. And I remember reading it avidly. And I got about halfway through when he talks about sending the Harvard students out to Dorchester and Roxbury to interview real people, to understand what the world was like. And I realized, shit, they're interviewing my students. right? That they were going out and interviewing folks who were going to Bunker Hill Community College, to Mass Bay Community College. So how we reduce it, I think, is when you look at, I think crisis helps. And never waste a good crisis. And I think the crisis being felt by four-year colleges in the humanities is a perfect opportunity to make friends at the community colleges, because they have half of your incoming students, probably, especially if you're a public. But more than that, if we want to keep a middle class in America, if we want to educate the people who are Black and brown, who are going to be the majority in our society, if we want to hang on to American values, we've got to create education as the beating heart. And one of the things that I have seen just that's extraordinary, and I see my colleague Howard Walk, who said this to Bro Adams, who is the NEH head under Obama. What Howard said is, how can our students who've had such limited lives where they've never seen anything except Superman and the Super Bowl, right? It's such limited exposure to the depth of the humanities. How do they imagine a life for themselves that they've never lived? How do they see themselves in a world that allows them to take control if there are no stories for them? So I think it's an incredibly important opportunity to do that. And I would love it if the New York Times helped us do that.
You know, I think that we have to bring the passion that we in this room have for education and for broadly the liberal arts to larger groups of people. I say this with love to fellow Americans, but you don't look like America looking at the audience. That's the elephant in the room for anybody of color. And it's not that you shouldn't be here. We should just have a bigger room to have some more people. Give me a round of applause for that idea, please. All right? And I'm saying it that way because I'm not trying to make anybody defensive. It's not about anybody's fault. It's a structural issue as we think about underrepresentation, whether it's in science or in the humanities. I mean, and a part of this is going to require us to find ways of connecting life. And people earlier today were saying this, life to the humanities. What we do at UMBC in our Center for Democracy and the work with Imagining America and the work we're doing with community colleges as we connect faculty members and we get students coming back and forth and being a part of programs is to show them how being rooted in the humanities will give them the power to think in a way that will change lives in so many ways. And for me, I'm a child leader with Dr. King. I went to jail at 12 for two reasons, literally for democracy, because Dr. King said I shouldn't have to have hand-me-down books from white children, that I should be able to have good books. I mean, new books so that we're not torn up. And I will tell you, having been reading literature before that, having the ability to hear him and think about what he said, really made me passionate about wanting to go to jail so little kids could get a better education. But that's rooted in the humanities. It is understanding Thoreau and civil disobedience, for example. And so what I'm suggesting is that we bring a level of honesty to the conversation about underrepresentation, about ways of making it real. When we're working with this problem of women in computer science, this is a part of democracy. If all these jobs are in technology and under 20% of the majors in computer science are women, compared to 36% years ago, we got a real problem. Because if only the people at the top are men, then all the issues that affect women involving technology are not being included. And how can you talk about democracy and freedom if people aren't in the room? It was that way with breast cancer versus prostate cancer, same thing. And so I would suggest that we find ways of connecting these disciplines, of bringing some way of the application. Women become more involved in education and engineering, as is the case with people of color, when they can see the benefit, when they can see that it's not just about the math, but it's about what difference will this make. And I think we can do that in the humanities. For us, it is about bringing technology into those disciplines in interesting ways. Imaging and digital arts, for example, data science. I mean, these are all wonderful areas where you can be rooted in the social sciences and the humanities, using technology as a tool, but it makes people even more connected to what's going on.
Gail, what is not just the greatest, but the most unhelpful misconception that people have about the students that LaGuardia and other community colleges educating?
That they're losers. They're losers, right? That they have failed, that they're this. I was interviewed on Bloomberg News once by, I won't name her, but a newscaster who said, you're just failure factories. And, this is where I think I'm so articulate, except when I really have to like punch somebody in the face and I had no idea what to say, but really that belief. And instead, what we have in community college in America, I think, are mostly poor people. It's so LaGuardia, 2/3, about 50,000 students, 2/3 of those students were not born in the United States. They come from 160 different countries. They speak 110 different languages. There's no sort of majority there. There's no really minority there because everyone's a minority when you look in the class. But when you see what they are, there are people who've never had a chance. They're overwhelmingly first generation. They're overwhelmingly Latinx and Black, I would say, because there's a lot of Caribbean and other folks there, Africans. How do you really think about them as our next leaders, as our next workforce? The other piece, I think, that's another underside of public higher education is that they are also almost, in the City University of New York, there are more than 50% of all the students who get a baccalaureate in the City University of New York. So Hrabowski, in his work on social mobility, said that of the top 10 colleges in the United States, I believe 6 of them are CUNY. I'm like, well, that sort of underestimates half of that started out at a community college. So part of it is going to the facts and going back to your first question to me, Frank, it's that idea that we have that we know what college is, that the typical co-ed is not a woman from Columbia who is working 2 jobs and has 2 kids and is still going to school full time. And yet, when you look at the demographics of who goes to college, she's much more modal than the young white woman who's spending full time at Vassar. So we have to break apart our misconceptions of who's there. But the other piece that is so painful to me is that students themselves internalize that belief. So students at LaGuardia feel embarrassed because they don't speak English well enough, even though it might be their 2nd, 3rd, or 4th language, right? That they really studied to be a mathematician in Uzbekistan, but they don't know the American terms for some of the things. So part of it is, it does go both ways, and I think it's incumbent upon faculty at four-year colleges, faculty at community colleges, to really understand that part of growing the humanities is listening, and listening to the extraordinary stories. Hearing students at LaGuardia is like hearing Holocaust stories, but in 2012, right? What happened to them in Sudan? What happened to them in Uzbekistan? What happened to them in China? The power of that, and if you can incorporate that into the curriculum, I think that the humanities become so alive. I watch students do 3 things at LaGuardia. They did Lorraine Hansberry, do you say that? Am I saying that right? Hansberry, thank you. Raisin in the Sun, they put on that play. At the same time, they interviewed 3 people, 2 African-American and 1 Jewish, who could not buy a house in the early 50s in Queens. And then they interviewed people in their own community who were being displaced because of gentrification. So that layering of the human experience where they saw themselves and they saw the history and they believed that this is what being alive and learning is, it's such profound and important education that I think if we embrace our diversity that is in American higher ed, just not at places like Harvard, it is at UMBC, it is at LaGuardia, that we will create the kind of education that we really want.
Yeah, and I appreciate this notion of taking the strengths of the students. We always talk about them as vulnerable, but when my students come, whether they are from inner city Baltimore or they are first generation American, they bring such strengths that we sometimes don't recognize. We have no idea what they've gone through to get there, whether they're 35
right.
or 19. But I want us to think about culture There's a book called The Geography of Bliss that says culture is the sea we swim in, all consuming, so much so that we fail to recognize it until we get out of it and look back at it. Right now, we all make so many assumptions about what happens at a community college. If we only went to the Ivies, we make assumptions about public institutions that are not a UVA. And if we're from Publix, we make assumptions about the Ivies. And I would suggest we've got some wonderful institutions in every sector. I enjoy doing things up at Harvard. I mean, we get as many as 12 kids at Harvard in a year. I mean, it's a good story. It's fine. We've got them on the faculty there now. So I'm proud of that. But I'm also saying, as a challenge, people who've not been in the public sector, in public universities, tend to assume that they are not of the same quality, even as we think about what quality means. And if it's in the area of the sciences, you'll find places that you've never heard of that may be sending people on to get the PhDs and the MDs. And it's very important that people know about that. But this is the theme I'd like this group to think about. It is the culture of our institutions and the culture of our society. We as a university had to decide it was very important to work with community colleges, not just on the periphery, but to make that a big part of what we do in the curriculum, in looking at it, in understanding the students we get, in making students feel comfortable well before they get to us. So that's a piece of it. And then the Center for Civic Engagement and Democracy, the big question for this group, it seems to me, when thinking about the liberal arts, is are we preparing students to live in a world where we know how to not just present our own arguments, but to listen to different points of view without being condescending quickly or without just dismissing them. And then that point about that Fred Lawrence makes about finding the common ground. On our campuses, and I said this at a big ACE talk last year, and it made people uncomfortable, but I'm gonna say it because I say on our campus, get beyond your comfort zone. I don't want you spending all of your time just with one group. It's fine to know one's own culture, but to be broadly educated, I would argue that we need to know other cultures. We need to know people different from ourselves, income-wise, race-wise, men, women, other groups. And right now, in American higher education, we are desegregated in the sense that people can go to all kinds of places. We are not integrated. I mean, and nobody wants to talk about it. And it seems to me it's through the humanities that we have the opportunity to find ways of bringing people together to have these difficult conversations across many boundaries. Right now, we stay within our groups. And all you have to do is go to campuses and look around. And that's all types. And it's fine, again, to support each culture, but what are we doing deliberately, proactively to ensure that I know somebody different from myself, somebody who grew up in New York, somebody who, you know what I mean? Across all the boundaries, whether it's religion, because we got all the religions. When you talk about race, you talk about sexuality, and Maryland is one of the best educated states in the union. We have all the national agencies there. We got all these PhDs there, but you've got the richest and the poorest, and you've got the least well-educated and the best educated. And so in some counties, everybody looks exactly the same. In a place outside of DC, you'll have 150 languages spoken, and you know within a matter of minutes who comes from what kind. Right. And so the job we have when thinking about how we use the broad education is to mix it up, to get them thinking about ideas, different perspectives, and to gain the ability to be comfortable in uncomfortable situations. You know, we don't do that now in a proactive way. And that is the challenge we face when thinking about the culture of America and the culture of higher education. And if we can't do it through the liberal arts, it cannot be done. Think about it.
And I would say sometimes, Freeman, that we like to think of curriculum as the way to do that.
Right.
And that's a very safe way.
Right.
So I think about a curriculum of religious tolerance,
Yes.
right? Well, when you're reading about it, it's very fine. That's very different from the faculty at LaGuardia, and I'm sure at UMBC, where a student raises their hand in the English class and says, well, my pastor says I don't have to read that text. Right. What the heck do you do then? Yeah. And have we prepared our faculty to really engage with difference? I would argue that we need to do a lot more of supporting college faculty to teach to a group of students that have never before, I think in the history of the world, but I tend to be hyperbolic, that have sat together.
No, we are so different from, when the Freddie Gray situation occurred in Baltimore, some of my faculty colleagues and we don't have enough minority faculty members either. We may have 8 or 9% Black and 5 or 6% Hispanic, with a population that's at least half minority. So we are working on it too. So I'm not speaking from a pedestal here. That the American professoriate is still 80-some% white in it. So this is a challenge. And so when we say we're so enlightened, the question is, why is it we can't use that enlightenment to bring in more people? But I'll never forget, the big problem we had was that some people in the social sciences knew how to talk about these issues of race and gender and class, and particularly violence and urban settings. But many said, I'm not equipped to do that. And the students want to talk about this stuff in my engineering class, in my literature class. And I'm scared that if I open it up, we'll get into arguments, because you got people from Baltimore, but you got people from Carroll County, which is 99% white. People think very differently. How am I to handle that? So we began a process then with this idea of democracy and professional development of faculty, of teaching faculty, giving them the opportunity to learn how to ask the good questions, how to create an environment in which people can ask questions, and there can be a level of respect. So you don't end up with violence or just anger, but rather deep reflection, a calmness of getting people to breathe deeply and to think about it. And we've been going through that for several years. I mean, for me as a president, it has been important for my students from counties that are not, who did not vote for the Democratic candidate, to know I am their president too. Right. Because I was chairing one of the Obama commissions, they would have a way of just saying, well, we have our president now. Right. And I had to work on myself. And believe it, reading history was very helpful to me in finding ways of letting them know we can talk about these things. Because if we can't talk about these things, we don't make any progress. And so I would argue this is the challenge we face when we think about democracy. It's not just to get people to think as we do, but it is to create an environment in which we can bring others under the tent and have those conversations.
You maybe just touched on this a little bit, but in each of your cases, you either were or have been at the helm of your institutions for decades. Many changes in the political tenor of the country during that time, in the job market, in the demographics. Sure. Are the missions of your institutions today the same as they were 20 years ago? Or if not, how have they changed?
I think for LaGuardia, the biggest challenge has been the increasing numbers of students who come from other discourse communities, other languages, and the whole immigration status. I'm sorry I forget the name of the professor from Bard, but you were talking about how citizen, like that used to be like, of course, we're going to teach citizenship. And all of a sudden, like, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. What is the definition of that? And how, I think about how to create a sense of, I'm going to say it, entitlement. I want the students who graduate from LaGuardia to feel, I can go into any room in New York City, and I know what to do, and I know how to be that. I want them to have that sort of sense of entitlement. But how do you use a college education, which is sort of, we have state ed, we have the feds, we have all these layers of rules. How do you create a college education that gives somebody a sense of their own identity, of who they are in this situation, in this context? And you have the students at LaGuardia with their religious context. You have their Jamaican parents saying, don't talk to those Chinese, they're like really bad. And like there's a lot, so there, all the racism of the history of the world comes into diverse places. And LaGuardia had to really think, how do you create a curriculum for students from 160 different countries? And I think part of it is, you teach faculty to embrace a different kind of dialogic process so that you engage the students. And I think that was one of the challenges. The other thing is, frankly, one of the pieces that made me feel personally like a turncoat is I worked really hard when Obama was in office to get students to sign up for DACA. And as soon as that changed, I felt like I had, I'll get emotional, I felt like I had given Nazis the names of the Jews in my community. It just felt so awful to have worked so hard to protect these students and to find out that that very thing that we did exposed them to harm. So those are some of the things in which LaGuardia had to change.
We have worked very hard to protect our students. We have large numbers who are from immigrant families with different circumstances. Yeah. And some things we talk about, some things we don't. But it has been very important to be sensitive to what they're going through and to have conversations with colleagues, Because if you've not been in that, if you don't understand what somebody feels, if they've not been documented, you have no sense of the lack of security that they feel. It's very, and so we have kids who are the children of College Park and Hopkins professors and others who are first generation college, 30-some%. It's great. So it's a great diversity that way. But what I will tell you is that the several things we have become even more determined to do. Number one, to focus on what we can do to help with pre-K through 12 more than ever. We are really, with a lot of grants and working on those issues and on everything from particularly, I say if you give me a child who can read well, I can teach her to do word problems. The reading is at the beginning of all of it. Adam Falk is some way. He's a physicist. I mean, he knows you cannot do physics problems if you can't read because it's word problems, right? And so the idea of working more closely and being able to demonstrate that it's making a difference, that the children are learning to read critically and can pass those tests, very important. That's one thing. On the other end, for us, it has been a matter of redesigning the curriculum and having a major innovation grant program that gives faculty opportunities for release time, to bring in other people, to rethink how we're doing things. And that's in everything from digital humanities to even how we teach writing, to the chemistry discoveries, to breaking ground and how we have infused this idea of civic engagement throughout the curriculum on many levels and given people all kinds of support to do that, right? With the idea that we need to knock down the boundaries between the university and that community around us. And that's not just the local community. We are doing it in rural Kenya with clean water structures and engineering, but also in Baltimore City. So we're rethinking who we are as a university. And the final point is, because we are a microcosm of the country, and you find people voting, while Maryland is more liberal than most, you still have a substantial number who would be supportive of a very conservative agenda as we see right now. How do we work effectively with them? And you don't do that by making them feel alienated. Got to be able to bring them into the conversation and respect them and understand why they feel as they do. And if you find out, for example, as I have, that somebody's father lost a job and thought he was going to get some help from another administration and thinks this is going to work, you got to work with that, right? So, and it does take broad education to figure out how not just to get upset when people say things that sound so outlandish, and how to encourage colleagues to allow them to say it, because the unexamined life, if you can't put on the table what you really think, then you're just being quiet because it's a liberal place and you leave there feeling exactly as you did. And I think that's one of the failures of us. We have not found ways, and it's not a yes or no, but I'm saying we've got to find ways to give people a chance to say what they really think, whether it's about gender, race, sexual, all these issues, so we can examine them. We need much more of the examination without a right or wrong answer than we have right now.
How is public policy most perversely at odds with your ability to attract the students you want to, educate graduates, serve them as you want to? And are there some things we might actually do? I mean, not just pie in the sky notions, some very common sense things we could do in the realm of public policy that would make your jobs easier and your institutions more successful?
Well, part of it is that we have a federal financial aid process that is perfectly designed for somebody like my daughter, middle-class kid who went to Vassar, right out of high school, and we, delivered her to Vassar, and it was great, right? For working adults,
Right.
for people with kids,
Right.
there is no financial aid structure that really helps them. For working folks whose job is gone, who need just something to get them back on their feet and then layer that into a more broad education, there is no financial aid for that. So we are structured on basically, I'm going to call it like a 1952 federal financial aid process that also used to pay for most of your college, and federal financial aid absolutely allowed you to live. So the other piece that community colleges are dealing with, but all colleges are dealing with, is homelessness, is hunger. I mean, these are like, we're talking in such lofty things about, what I felt like when I read To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, like, oh my God, I thought I died and went to heaven. That all is true. But can you do that if you're trying to decide, as our students do, between a subway card and lunch? It's really, really hard to do that. So we have not made public policy that allows going to college to be an option for low-income students or for working adults. We also have these weird things that we don't allow anything beyond a very traditionally assigned four-year college, whether it's the first 2+2 or a four-year college. And yet education increasingly, is blowing out. We have micro-credentials. We have just-in-time needs. We have nothing to really look critically at that. And as a policy person, I'm like scared about doing that because there's so little federal financial aid. If we open it up to the micro-credentials, I feel like the for-profit companies are just going to eat our lunch. So the complexity of this is really hard, but I think there is a rethinking of America's belief in higher education. Just about 100 years ago, at the turn of the century, we basically said, look, kids are coming off the farm. We're going to have to educate them. We started a system of free public higher education. And I think the time is right to really think about free public higher education instead of high school.
When we think about the 60s, most people don't realize that only 10% of Americans that graduated from college, only 10%. And you break it down, at that time, everything was black and white. It was only 2 or 3% of blacks, but it was only 11% of whites.
Yeah.
So 90% of Americans didn't even think about the fact that their kids could go to college. Yeah. It was only because of public policies, Higher Education Act, for example, that in the 65, and then Pell Grant, that we began to do something. And all of that occurred, as everybody knows, because that GI Bill in the 40s had the first veterans going. And who was it that was against the GI Bill? College presidents, beginning with the president of Harvard and Chicago. They said, if you allow veterans into our institutions, the institutions will become, quote, academic hobo jungles.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay? Now, these were fine, liberally educated men, height of the liberal arts, okay? And I bring it up because we need to think about what will people say about us years from now as we take such pride in the fact that we know Proust and Sartre, right? What will they say about, well, did they really get it? And so what happened was the veterans came in, and within 2 or 3 years, a couple of million had been so disciplined they did well that Americans began to say, maybe regular people can go to college. Now, they were mainly white men, not enough women, not enough people of color, but regular people. So we began in the late 40s and then into the mid-60s. Now, why do I tell you that? Fact is, half the people who start college never get a degree, 4-year degree. And we have the same kind of issue with the 2-year. And if you were to really break it down, this is what I mean by disaggregating the data. You'd have the most prestigious of places having 90 to 100%, right? Public or private, the most prestigious with the wealthiest of families. And you look at the regular places in the Midwest, and I'm not even talking about minorities, I'm talking about just working class whites. Mm-hmm. And you find colleges easily with retention and graduation rates in the 30-some percent. Mm-hmm. And then you put in that for-profit group, my God, and you see places 12 to 15%. And so what am I saying? I'm suggesting that public policy needs to look at, first, how we define graduation rate. I think it's absolutely unacceptable to think only about first-time, full-time freshmen for graduation rate, that we need a way of giving people credit when a returning person comes back and goes in and out and then graduates. How do we document that? That is success. It really is. And then most important for me, the question of how to get the public feeling for working class people. I mean, we should continue to feel for those at the very bottom. But if we just see the stories of all the working people who started college and never graduated and have a couple of kids and want to come back and get a 4-year or 2-year degree, right? We could think about ways of really elevating the economy. Our state, Maryland, is one of the few states that America should look to as an example when thinking about higher education and politics. We have bipartisan support. Most people can't even spell those words. All right? We've got a Republican governor who is reasonable and a Democratic legislature in a mainly Democratic state. And we in higher education got more money this year to build the economy than we've ever gotten in my 30-some years in higher education. All right? And when I look at it, it is that people are talking to each other. They do get it that our economy will depend on the level of education of the citizenry. We know we've got so many jobs going unfilled. And one other part of that you'll appreciate, if you Google the Greater Washington Partnership, because they look at things in Virginia in DC and in Maryland, from Virginia Tech up to Hopkins and all of us in between the University System of Maryland campuses. And we've come up with an approach that says we need to bring many more people from the humanities and the arts into the workforce when they are interested in it, all right, with some technology. So we have come up with ways of mapping certain courses, not a lot, that they would need to get into great opportunities in marketing and graphic design, all kinds of areas. So they'll have that humanities degree with the certificate and be guaranteed a job. And so that's the kind of creative policy that we need to be looking at broadly to make a difference. Bipartisan support. The states where you've had awful drop in budgets, from Alaska to Illinois, you see the impact. Those places that can get people working together, because we're going to always have two parties. How do we get them working together and to focus on education and higher education?